Welcome to Murder Party. Let's go. Population Chromageddon. We are now in Murder Party. The town of DFD is just, it's Murder Town. I don't know if you caught that or not. Who wouldn't want to play Murder Party, the Mario version?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That sounds amazing.
Hello and welcome to Woeful Wednesdays. Nathan reads a series of unfortunate events. Ignore the tattoo. My name is Nathan.
And I'm Tyler.
And so if you're new to this, what we're doing is we are reading through a series of unfortunate events. I'm reading this for the first time. Tyler has read this several times before, including as a middle grade reader. And we are looking at the Vile Village this week. And basically, we're looking at each book, and we're going to go through each one and split it up into 3 different videos. And so we go chapters 1 to 4, 5 to 8, and then 9 to 13. So for this week, we are on to book the 7th. So we are almost halfway through the project. Very, very close to halfway through the project. So book the 7th, The Vile Village, and we are specifically looking at chapters 1 to 4.
Yeah, and I understand we do have a sponsor for today's episode.
Yeah, we sure do. So our sponsor for this week is Pennywise Hot Air Balloon Homes. We float, you'll float. Come float with us forever and ever. And ever. We all float over here. Floating hot air balloons.
Yeah, there's no one I trust with eternal floating more than Pennywise.
That's what I'm saying. This dude is like this hot air balloon home that floats forever and you can never land. I'm like, what? This is a good thing? This is your retirement plan?
Yep.
And then he's invited the children onto this thing. How creepy is that?
Yeah, and I don't think, I mean, we're going to get into this, but I don't think that he even has the legal standing to do so, since the entire...
No, it's definitely going to be kidnapping.
Right, the entire village is their guardian, not just this one guy.
Right. He's proposed this plan to get them on his floating home that can never land, or at least will never land, because he has no intention of ever landing. And he wants to take these 3 children where there's no escape. There's nothing they can do.
Yep. Hector is an odd man.
But they're really taking a liking to him. Like, this is, you know, they're taking a liking to him, but to me, that's what makes this book so great. So creepy, right from the very beginning.
Yes. Yeah. So we are going to get into all that and more, I'm sure. Yeah, I hope everyone enjoys.
Yep. Ignore the tattoo! Nathan unfortunately reads a series of unfortunate events at an unfortunate age, which in this case is being used to indicate that he is entirely too old to be reading this for the first time. All right, so we are looking at book the 7th, The Vile Village, and we are specifically looking at chapters 1 to 4. And Tyler, you've got plot summary duty for the week.
Yeah, so we start out with basically Mr. Poe has discovered this this new initiative going around with some of the local towns where they are, or local villages, I should say. Based around the idea of it takes a village to raise a child, and so these villages are adopting orphans into their care in order to take care of them until they come of age.
Right. And I just wanted to point out that we were just talking about this in, I think, was it the last video that we did last week?
I think so.
Maybe it was, where I was saying that it's so strange that these books, there's really no church that's in running orphanages. And you've had that historically. And then the state doesn't seem to be doing it either. And then we're starting to see the development of the welfare system, right? It's like FDR's New Deal or something. I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing that we hop right into that, like, as soon as we started catching on to...
I know. I was reading it, and I'm like, oh, we were just talking about it. He must have heard. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, so the children decide to go with with a town referred to only by three initials, VFD. And so they take a bus to get there, and then they have to walk across this barren landscape in order to reach there. And they find that the VFD village is covered in crows, a whole plethora of murder of crows.
Yeah, murders of crows, perhaps, right?
Right.
Murders upon murders of crows.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so they then they meet the Council of Elders, who have imposed it looks like tens of thousands of rules, and that means that the children are not able to even respond to the Council of Elders when they're asking them, if they have any questions, which, yeah, seems a little ridiculous,
Right.
to say the least. Yes, so they are going to be living with Hector, the village caretaker or repairman, I suppose. And then they go out to the Nevermore tree, which is where his house is, and this Nevermore tree is where all the ravens perch at night. And then Hector tells
Is it ravens or crows?
I'm sorry.
Because I feel like it alternates, but maybe I'm wrong. Because I think it's just crows, is it not?
Yes. Yeah, I believe so.
I don't know if he ever mentions ravens.
Yes. My apologies.
No, sorry. It's just I do know that they are different birds, even though
yes, yeah,
a lot of people think that they're the same, but they are different.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, so I believe they are crows, and then so Hector has this inventing workshop, which Violet will be very interested in, even though mechanical inventions are not permitted in this village.
Yeah.
And Hector also has a bit of a library, even though any book that violates any of the rules or discusses things that violate the rules are not permitted in the town. And then they get this couplet. They find this couplet, like Hector has it, that he had just discovered this morning. And then the children need to find out where this couplet came from, because it does appear to be from Isadora, the missing Quagmire triplets. And then right at the end, they get a second one. At the end of those 4 chapters, they find a second couplet. Yeah. I think that about does it.
Yeah,
There's a lot that happens, but not.
No, you got it. I think that's it. And so why don't we get into the actual chapters then? Because I've got other stuff that I want to say, but we'll start by diving into this. So why don't you go first? Because I think I typically go first. So you go ahead and get started with your notes.
Sure. All right, so my first note that I'd like to talk about is on page 6. And this whole discussion of the Daily Punctilio, which is the local newspaper, which seems to have a horrible editor, horrible writers, everything like that. They have no journalistic integrity. They are misspelling names and everything. But I do have an extra note about this, which is, most of my notes are like 2 parts. Because, this is a great way of establishing all the backstory that we need to know if you have not read any of the previous
that's a great point.
Series.
Yes.
Because it, sets these things up, and then the children are able to riff off of it and correct things and give further details. So it's a great way of doing that. We do get a note later on. Let me see. I know that I have the page marked. I believe it is on page 74. I know I'm jumping way ahead here.
That's okay.
But on page 74, then Lemony Snicket says that here just at the top of page 74. I myself fell in love with a wonderful woman who was so charming and intelligent that I trusted that she would be my bride, but there was no way of knowing for sure, and all too soon circumstances changed, and she ended up marrying someone else, all because of something she read in the Daily Punctilio. So Lemony Snicket has laid his bias out in that moment much later than when he has, pointed out how bad the journalism is in the Daily Punctilio.
Okay. Page 74. I have a note. My note says, is that why Snicket has an anti-media bias?
Yes.
So it's so funny because like I've got notes on like the terrible reporting and then that point later on. So it's just funny that you bring that up because I'm like, I know exactly where you're going with this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting because I feel like I mean we know that he does seem to take some liberties with the story, even though he claims that this is, very
Yeah.
accurate.
He's acting as a journalist, but now he's disparaging journalists. But then he seems to do what they do of embellishing and inventing some details in the
Yeah.
text. So it's just he's one of these self-hating, terrible journalists. You know the type.
Yeah, very hypocritical.
Right.
Yeah. But yes, so that is one of my two-part notes. I have another one, but I'm going to talk about that later on.
Okay.
And then on page 10, I believe this is still in chapter 1, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, on page 10, then we get a nice little reference here around the middle of the page in the main paragraph there with Mr. Poe talking on the phone. Poe here, okay, I thought so. Okay, thank you, Mr. Fagin. That is a great little reference to Oliver Twist.
Oh, okay. Did you look that up or you just knew it?
I knew it. I have read Oliver Twist, and yeah, I did remember. Like that, the name seemed very familiar, and I was like, okay,
Uh-huh.
I gotta double check that. So I did look
Hmm.
it up to make sure. But
Right.
uh, but yes, of course, Oliver Twist is one of, I'm sure, the chief inspirations for this entire series.
Exactly.
It's all about, you know, uh, the Victorian era, orphanages, yeah, these despicable people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And a
so it is,
series of unfortunate events.
yes. Yeah,
Lowercase. Right.
right.
And yeah, that's a good observation. Yeah, I did not catch that, so that's good.
Yeah. And then on page 14, I don't know what's going on here. At the bottom of the first paragraph here, then Mr. Poe is talking here, and he says, normally I approve of more traditional family structures. That's problematic in and of itself. But this is really quite convenient, and your parents' will instructs that you be raised in the most convenient way possible. Since when has that been the case?
Right. He doesn't say, I found a revised version of your parents' will. It just says
Right.
your parents' will says that. It's like, no, it doesn't. We know this. The will said that they had to be raised by their nearest living relative,
Yeah.
their
Yep.
closest living relative, whatever it was. But yeah, not the most
Oh.
convenient way possible.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, so those are my only notes
okay, but
for
I want to
chapter.
talk about this. So you're saying that it's problematic because he says normally I approve of more traditional family structures.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Which,
you're saying, but like I like because I get what you're saying because that evokes the idea that he is opposed to, let's say, a same-sex couple or a single parent or something
right.
like that. But
Yeah.
wouldn't everyone agree with him that this is a very non-traditional thing of having 3,000 people care for these
Yeah.
children, that is non-traditional, that even if like you know what I mean, because you say it's two parents, it's one parent, it's like same sex, it's opposite sex, all right, this is all
Yeah.
like that's all still at least to some degree traditional parenting. This seems like such
Mhm.
unorthodox parenting that I
Right.
I
Yeah.
get what you're saying, but I
Yeah.
also
Yeah,
kind of. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose what I'm saying here is I'm surprised, as you have often been, that this hasn't been torn apart. But I do feel
Yeah.
like it is a bit of uh, a commentary for the pro side of it, where it's like, all things considered,
Is it?
as long as it's not a community of 3,000 people, then you're still dealing with a traditional uh,
Maybe.
family structure.
I
So you
think you
could
could
read it either
you
way.
can read it either way,
Yeah.
because you could also look at that and say that he normally approves of the more traditional family structure, and then he's saying, but this is the most convenient thing possible. So then is it saying, like, well, it'd really be best for you to be raised by two parents and not a single parent, but this is convenient, so we'll just do this? Or it'd be best if you were raised by a man and a woman and not two men or two women, um,
Hmm.
but this is convenient. I've got, a nice, you know, married gay couple here, and they'll take you in, so it's
Right.
convenient. Like,
Yeah.
and then going, that's not how you should make these decisions. Like, I'm not saying you
Yeah.
shouldn't make decisions based off of the couple. I'm saying you shouldn't be like, oh, they're here. That's convenient.
Right.
Adoption shouldn't be just based off of convenience.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
there's all kinds of problems with everything he says.
Oh, absolutely. So it is interesting. I do want to briefly touch on this on the note of Mr. Poe and the Daily Punctilio. Um, in the Netflix series,
Mhm.
they made the surprising decision to make Mr. Poe's wife the chief writer at the Daily Punctilio.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Have you looked up punctilio? What does that mean?
I have not really looked into it. Um, yeah, I know I should. I feel like I have before, but I don't
Hmm.
recall if it had any meaning or what meaning it had.
Okay.
Um, yeah. Yeah, we can come back to that because the Daily Punctilio does come back again, I believe, uh, in the future books or later on in this one.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so those are my only notes for chapter one.
Okay. So there might be a little bit of repetition here, but I've got different comments on this. So first of all, at the very beginning on page one, it's such an interesting thing that he's doing here. This commentary about uh, what you read and what you don't read. So I'm just going to read from the beginning there. It says, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, and no matter how many people are chasing you, what you don't read is often as important as what you do read. And then he gives us an example. For instance, if you're walking in the mountains and you don't read the sign that says beware of cliff because you're busy reading a joke book instead, you may suddenly find yourself walking on air rather than on a sturdy bed of rocks. Um, and then he gives a couple other examples, right? Humorous examples of this. But boy, what an interesting way to start a book.
Mhm.
Because it it's so significant. Like, this is a conversation that parents have all the time, where they'll be happy that their children are reading, but they're not happy with what they're reading.
Right. Yeah.
And it's, on the one hand, and I've heard most children's authors and people who are involved in the industry, agents and publishers, like editors and the like, will say, like, and I mean, like, Neil Gaiman, for instance, has said that essentially whatever gets kids reading is good because it ultimately ends up acting, I don't know if he uses this term, but I've used this term before on the podcast, it acts as a gateway drug, essentially, right?
Yeah.
That it it gets them to realize, oh, I can enjoy that book, maybe I can enjoy other books, and whatever encourages them to keep going. That you basically, you don't ever need to correct children and say, like, that's not literature, it's not literature with a capital L, or it's not
Right.
canonical, or this isn't classic literature, and it's tripe, it's trash, it's drivel, whatever, right? All of these criticisms that you could have of a lot of stuff that kids might be reading. I mean, I know, for instance, when you were a kid, you were a big fan of the Captain Underpants series.
Yes. Yes, I was.
And I mean, like, that's not exactly, reading Treasure Island. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
where you've
Also
just got like
read.
this. What's that?
I have also read Treasure Island, but that was much later. So
Right.
yeah.
But that's what I'm saying though, but it was much
Yeah.
later, right?
Yeah.
That you're reading this book and it just seems gratuitous and vulgar and it's like, oh, tell that man to put some pants on and it's on the cover of every one of these books. And,
Yeah.
and so that's kind of the discussion that you often hear about with children's literature, and then the defense is even like bad books, they're not necessarily bad books, right? I'm not saying that they are, but
Mhm.
even like books that are not maybe the most literary often lead kids to more challenging texts.
Yeah.
And so it, but that is the criticism that parents make all the time. It's saying you shouldn't be reading a joke book, right? Don't
Right.
you understand that
Yeah.
that's not good for your mind? It's a waste of your time. You're not going to grow as a reader. And then even as an adult, then adults have to justify what they read and what they don't read all the time. And I mean, I know for myself, I have to make these decisions constantly because I always like my to be read pile just continues to grow and grow and grow, and it's
Mhm.
been doing this for I don't know how many years, certainly
Yeah.
like I don't know, the last 20. It's just I can't keep up with all the books that I want to read.
Yeah.
And every time I read a book, I'm making the decision to not read other books.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that is can be a crippling feeling of going,
Absolutely.
oh, but
Yeah.
if I'm going to spend an hour reading, do I want to read this instead of reading that or that or that? And I want to be judicious with my time. And this,
Mhm.
I'm looking at it going, you're right, dude. I shouldn't be reading this. I need to read something else. So
Oh man.
that's where
Yeah.
I'm saying that it's a really interesting way to start the book. But I think it's more relevant with children's literature and that discussion
Yeah.
than what I'm talking about with that you're always whatever you do read, ultimately you're choosing not to read everything else. So anything that you
Right.
do read must be more important than everything else that you could read. And
Yes.
when
Yeah.
you start thinking about it like that, like I say, it can become crippling. Um,
Absolutely.
all right, and then the next page, this goes over to page 2,
Mhm.
that he does. It's a similar description as what we've had in previous books, but it sounds a little bit different in the way he describes it. So this is towards the bottom of that paragraph, the big paragraph on that page. He says, "The misery, woe, and treachery contained in the pages of this book are so dreadful that it is important that you don't read any more of it than you already have." And so, and he, because it's this long-winded passage where he's saying don't read this, and it's not going to make you feel good, and you should read basically anything else except for this. And that really is the best way, at least one of the best ways to get kids to read a book, is to
Yeah.
tell them that they shouldn't. uh,
Absolutely.
it, and that goes from when they're really young readers all through the teen years. I don't know how well it works after they're adults,
Right.
right? Because there is a staggeringly small amount of people who continue to read just independently of any, like after high school or college. It's the numbers are incredibly low. It's really bad. It's something like only 60%. It's been a while since I've looked up the numbers, but something like 60% have read a book within the last year, um, since or have read a book period since they graduated from high school.
Oh my
And
goodness.
then like 80% haven't read a book from when they finished, from when they had finished college.
Wow.
And so the
Wow.
only reason that that high school number is so much lower than the college one is because people then are forced to read something in college. But then when they're
Right.
finished college, they just don't read. And the number of Americans in particular who don't read a single book in a year is incredibly high. Like percentage wise, it's incredibly high. And
Wow.
so that's why I'm saying I don't know how well it works for adults to say,
Hmm.
oh, you shouldn't read this. It's a dangerous book, or it's a
Right.
risque book, or whatever else. But at the same time, you do look at the types of books that people do read, like something like 50 Shades of Grey, then
Right.
everybody read that because it's like, it's so, ooh, dare
Yeah.
I read this book? And that became this hit. So I'm like, I think it maybe does work, at least to some degree, with adults as well. Tell
Hmm.
them, I don't know if you should read this book. And they're like, well, now I have
Right.
to read it.
Yeah, it's kind of uh, the old adage of there's no such thing as bad publicity,
Yeah.
um, where, yeah, even telling somebody that there's something that they shouldn't do, then it does raise awareness about it. And there is a sense of, like, I know that not to get terribly off topic here, but I know that the Grand Theft Auto games have been caught with this before, where they intentionally leaked information about what would be in one of the games.
Hmm.
Um, and they had no intention of actually putting it in the game, but they knew that media outlets would grab onto that and say, look at how horrible this game is going to be. And so then all the media
Yeah.
outlets were talking about this game that
Uh-huh.
had yet to come out,
Yeah.
about something that they never planned to put in
Yeah.
it.
And I suspect, because if you look at this, that's a great point. I really like that. And I'm thinking about this in part from a marketing standpoint, that if you, who's buying these books? Is it kids who've got the cash who are going to a bookstore? And especially 20 years ago, right?
Right.
Before, like Amazon, I'm sure it was around then because I think Bezos started in the late 90s selling books online, but I don't know how popular it was. And because that's how Amazon started, as selling books. And I'm pretty sure it was like
Right.
96, 97 or something he started. So it was around, but I don't know how popular it was. But like 20 years ago, it wasn't like kids independently going to the bookstore, picking this up with their little wallet and
Right.
going up to the cash register and paying for it. It was a parent most of the time with them who was
Mhm.
buying it or ordering it from Scholastic with like the, flyers
Yes.
that like you bring home.
Oh man, I
That
love those things.
Yeah, me too. That is legitimately this is a genuine question because in case you folks do not know, Tyler and I are Canadian. I live in the U.S. now, but I grew up in Canada. I'm assuming that's a thing in America too, right? Scholastic, like
Yeah, I would
little
hope so.
booklets.
Because
It
it
can't.
was, yeah, and then you had the book fairs too.
Yeah, book
Um,
fairs. Yeah, and yeah, you
yeah,
would. Oh my goodness,
like
yeah.
in the school, they'd
That's
come
right.
out with all the different carts and
Yeah.
just open them up. Ah, it was great.
So, oh yeah, yeah, exactly. I like it's little things like that where you're like, I know exactly what it's like to be an American, and then you go, wait a minute, do you guys do that?
Right.
um, I'm assuming that it's a thing, but when you're looking at this, where Snicket places these in the books, he places it typically on page 1 or 2.
Right.
So my point here is that a parent will very often, before they purchase the book, the kid says, I want this. They hand their mom or their dad a book, and then the mother or father then picks it up and goes, what is this thing? Oh, well, serious, okay, right? They maybe read the back, and then many parents will read the first page or two.
Right.
You know what I
Right.
mean? And I wonder if it's this like what you're talking about with like Grand Theft Auto of make it edgy.
Yes.
Because I'm like, when you actually read these books, it's like they're not really that controversial or edgy, at least not for the reasons that
Yeah.
like Snicket seems to think. Um,
Yeah.
but if you know the parent is probably not going to read it, but they might read just a little bit. So you then have all these parents saying they shouldn't read that, they shouldn't read that. And then kids hear this, they're like, I'm not supposed to read that. Okay,
Yeah.
and then they go and read it. They get it from the library or wherever else. They borrow it from a friend. That it's a great way to essentially create false controversy
Yes.
as a
Yeah.
marketing ploy.
Absolutely. Yeah, and yeah, the ethics behind that are, questionable, but it's just like, from a marketing standpoint, it's brilliant, and
Yeah.
yeah.
That's why I'm really like I'm so reluctant to ever write something for middle grade or young adult. I'm just
Mhm.
like I just don't want to go anywhere near stuff that's marketed towards, anybody except for adults. I just
Right.
feel like you
Yeah.
can get into dicey ethical territory pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So, all right, my next note, and I promise I really don't have much more. I think I don't have one until like chapter 3 after this. So
Okay.
this is on page 4. Then this is going over the media stuff, and so Violet is talking about this. She then says Ugh, right? The word ugh was not in the newspaper, of course, but was something Violet uttered herself as a way of saying she was too disgusted to read any further. If I invented something as sloppily as this newspaper writes its story, she said, it would fall apart immediately. Violet, who at 14 was the eldest Baudelaire child, was an excellent inventor, blah, 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 blah. And then Klaus complains about this because we see all of the errors in this, and I just couldn't help it. Fake news. The dishonest media, these airsats newspapers with airsats journalists. It literally is fake news. And I'm like, yes. Yeah. Before this was a term. I love it so much. Somebody has to teach Donald Trump the word airsats. And then he's gonna start calling all the journalists airsats journalists. Airsats, okay, they're airsats journalists, folks. You know what that means? It means fake news. They're bad guys. You know, yes. We get one of them. I just love it. I'm like, we legitimately have got fake news in this book.
Absolutely.
And it's a real critique of the media, the way he explains it. Like this on page 3, he says that, like, I'm telling you, this is like Trump explaining how newspapers work. It says the Baudelaire orphans at the time the story begins were certainly wishing that they weren't reading the newspaper that was in front of their eyes. A newspaper, as I'm sure you know, is a collection of supposedly true stories written down by writers who either saw them happen or talked to people who did. These writers are called journalists, and like telephone operators, butchers, ballerinas, and people who clean up after horses. Journalists can sometimes make mistakes. Okay, people, they make mistakes. They're not perfect.
It's so true.
People who clean up after horses are journalists. That's all they're doing. They're just shoveling all of that crap, putting it out there, and the people are falling for it, but not you, not people here at my rally. Right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so Snicket and Trump would be great friends. They could just riff on the dishonest media and fake news. That is literally a description that would, like, that language is downright presidential.
Yes, absolutely.
I really don't have anything to say, like, as far as the story. I'm just, to me, it's just such a fun connection because that is exactly how Trump describes it. And whether you agree with him or not, whether you see evidence that the media is dishonest in certain ways, and you know what I mean, that's totally up to you. I'm just saying his description and this description, they are perfectly in line.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe he read this series.
Been doing a lot of research on the media. Read a book all about it.
Oh, man. Okay.
His name is Olaf. They call him Omar.
Right. Yeah. This Omar fella. It's just, that's not his name. Yeah, but Omar sounds more more foreign, I guess.
Yeah. I'm done with chapter 1 and chapter 2. So you can take over chapter 2.
Hopping into chapter 2 then, on page 23, I have a couple notes on here. Number 1, Klaus can't see past the smushed moth. I don't know how he's not able to move his head anywhere else around the window to see this thing. How large is this moth?
Why is the bus traveling sideways?
Yes.
How are the bugs getting squished against the side windows? That doesn't happen. Like, do all of the windows fan out or something? But then it'd only be the first row. It makes no sense. Has he never been in a vehicle ever?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's a really windy day.
And it's blowing them into it and they're dying? Oh my.
I know. Yeah, so that's my one note. The other is the Fata Morgana. That I have always been fascinated by that actual thing. and I always forget what it's called.
Hmm. Yeah.
That it is a mirage, but it's a specific kind of mirage.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so I just really like that he does give that whole description there. That's my only comment about that.
Hmm.
Um, and then I suppose on page 30, let me know if I end up getting to chapter 3. I forget where it starts.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, on page 31, let me see. Um, yeah, I don't know. We have them going through, like walking through the crows, um, and yeah, Lemony Snicket shows his cowardice here, I
Hmm.
suppose, where he would be standing on the edge of town for the rest of my life, whimpering with fear rather than take even one step into the crow-covered streets. But it only took the Baudelaires a few minutes to work up the courage to walk through all of the muttering, scuffling birds to town hall.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so number one, Lemony Snicket is, you know, not not very brave at all. And number
Yeah.
two, even the children, it took them several minutes. That's a
He
long time to
he
be standing.
writes things like that pretty often.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like I don't know if you have ever seen these clips on YouTube where people remove the laugh track, or not even the laugh track, because the studio audience laughter from a sitcom,
Hmm.
and how it ends up being really creepy, how the characters within the show just stare at each other for several seconds every
Yeah.
time, like they're all buffering or something. Every time somebody says something and they just kind of stand there and kind of move around, and then they say the next line and then everybody stands there and moves around. That
Yep.
if you actually portrayed this on stage or in a film or television show, the amount of times that he says that they stand there for several minutes, like he says that when they walk into the, like, whatever it is, the hall here, the community
Yep.
center, whatever it is,
Yeah,
in,
the town hall when they're standing, waiting to knock on the door.
well,
And
no, but then once they go in, then he says that they stand there for several minutes staring at them and they stare back because the Baudelaires couldn't think of
right.
what to say. Like, several minutes? I dare you to put that on screen. What is several? You're going to go a solid 180 seconds of them just staring, shot, reverse shot for 3 minutes plus. I'm just going,
Yeah.
why does he write it like that? I don't get it. Um,
Yep.
but have you ever seen Albert Hitchcock's movie The Birds?
Uh, uh, I've seen parts of it. I have not seen it start to finish. But yes, that was my main comment there, is that
Okay.
it's very reminiscent of that, of, this idea of just like, uh, we have to be very careful. The birds aren't attacking us at the moment,
Yeah.
so we can probably walk through as long as we're very calm about this, and that the birds are just staring at them this whole time.
Yes. Yeah, and it is very much like a scene out of The Birds. And Alfred Hitchcock, he directed that movie, but it's based off of a short story, The Birds, and I cannot remember the writer's name, but um, she's, I know, like, it's set in England, and man, is the short story good. I've read it probably 4 times, but it's been a while since I've read it. Man, is that a
Right.
great short story. And so I'm just reading this going, maybe Snicket watched The Birds or read the short story and then got creeped out more than you would think. Because
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's not like we associate, like, it's not like we associate crows with attacking people, right? If it
Yeah.
were the types of animals that we know attack people, then
Yeah.
maybe there'd be more trepidation. But with this, I'm like, there's a lot of them, but it still
Yeah.
doesn't seem that frightening.
Yeah. I mean, in all honesty, if I saw, 1,000 of any animal, uh, in one place, I would
Yeah,
probably be a little creeped out,
oh
but I
yeah,
wouldn't stand there for several minutes just staring at them.
right.
And I wouldn't be too terrified to even step into this area, depending
Right.
on what the animal is, I suppose. But yeah, like,
Yeah.
um, yeah, it kind of actually reminds me more of that Simpsons episode with all the babies in the daycare, and Homer and Marge are like trying to get to Maggie, and they just are walking through all of
Right.
them and just being stared at.
Right.
Um,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
where it's like even the babies, like because there's so many of them and they're just not doing anything,
That's
it's
right.
it's kind of creepy.
Yeah, agreed.
Yep. Um, all right, so my next note is on um uh is on page 40. And this is just the first mention of the Nevermore tree, which is of course a reference to Edgar Allan Poe.
Right.
Uh, Nevermore, nevermore. So, yeah. Um, Fun times there.
Yeah, exactly. It is interesting because we already have Mr. Poe, then we have the
Yeah.
Nevermore tree, and then you have the crows. But of course, in the Raven, the poem
Yeah.
by Poe, then it's a raven, not a crow. But they're similar looking, so
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly why Handler decided to go with crows instead of going with
because
ravens.
is it called a murder of ravens? I don't know
Mm,
if it is. I think he just wanted to say
gotcha.
murder. I think that's really
Right.
what it is.
Yes. Yeah. You are.
I
Yeah.
don't know
Most
what you
likely
call a group
correct.
of ravens, but I know for sure that you call a group of crows a murder. So I
Right.
think he just couldn't pass up that opportunity.
That is. Yeah. That's quite likely. All right. So hopping into chapter 3. Did you want to go first?
Um, sure. And so sorry, it's just the this is a ridiculous comment, okay? I'm just letting you know that this is absurd. But when they get
Okay.
there, because well, when do they find out what VFD stands for?
Oh, that's a great
Oh, it is,
question.
it is sorry, it is in chapter 3, at the
Yeah.
beginning. So yeah, so on page 50, then you find out that VFD stands for the Village of Fowl Devotees.
Hmm.
And anyway, this town is filled with elderly people. And I'm just saying, my last guess would have been a better description of this town: venereal freaking disease. Because if you don't know, folks, that is a real problem in retirement communities because people
Right.
of a certain generation, like legitimately, it's an actual health crisis that they just they're going at it and they don't care about protection or anything because they didn't grow up with that. And who
Yeah.
cares if I get whatever? I'm already elderly. And
Yeah,
so
and because, they don't have to worry about pregnancy, so they
right.
just shrug it off.
So when
Yeah.
like before we knew what VFD stood for, then I'm going in the back of my mind, even though you said that's not what it stands for, Nathan. I'm like, and it's a town full of elderly people. I think I was right, but no, it's it's Village of Fowl Devotees.
Yeah.
All right, so there was that point, and then the other one is on page 48. So this is only the second page of chapter 3.
Mhm.
Then Hector is asking them what they want to eat. So he says, "What shall we eat this evening? How about chicken enchiladas? That's a Mexican dish consisting of corn tortillas." And then he explains it. And then Violet says, "That sounds delicious. Isn't it enchiladas that was mentioned as being Sunny's favorite food?
Oh,
Or
I
was
think
it
you're right.
something else?"
I
I
think
feel like
you're
it was
right.
enchiladas.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it
It
was.
was in the last book, was it not?
I think so.
It was like a throwaway line that Snicket said,
Yeah.
and then she's listing all these like crunchy things that she likes to eat. And then her
Yes.
favorite food of all, like cheese enchiladas or chicken enchiladas or something like that. I think it was cheese enchiladas. And
Hmm.
then we were like, what a weird thing to say. Because that's not
Right.
even crunchy. And is it supposed to be funny that, like, oh, they like Mexican food in their house? But then there's no freaking mention that that's Sonny's favorite food.
Right. So I guess the the interesting thing is that right here, this could actually be the first time that Sunny is having them, and that it then becomes her favorite food
Okay.
because
Okay.
Snicket is writing this after the fact.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know, maybe.
The insights that we are pulling out of this book. This is the greatest discussion of this book that has ever happened or ever will happen. No one else will make that connection.
Right.
Something
Yes.
really happens, but
yeah, no, that's a
no,
really
but your
interesting
point though, that because Snicket is writing this after the fact, that maybe this is where we find out. So in the previous book, he says that they're her favorite food, and we were like, what? The Baudelaires were feeding their kid enchiladas, and so often that she decided that it was her favorite food out of all foods, and what baby likes enchiladas as like more than anything else? And like not growing up in a Hispanic home, like why would that be the thing? Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but maybe you're right. Maybe this is her first instance of eating it, and this is where it starts for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it does even say, like Violet says, that sounds delicious.
Exactly.
Um,
Not
yeah,
enchiladas are delicious or
right.
those are delicious.
Yeah,
There's not that certainty. Just that sounds like, oh, okay, that description sounds good because he gives an actual description. You don't
yeah.
have a we know what enchiladas are. That's our
Right.
favorite food, or it's Sunny's favorite food. We had it all the time. This is so insulting that you would even mention this, right?
Yes.
You don't have
I'm
Klaus
so
doing
glad
this.
that we've moved away from that with
Me
Klaus.
too. Me too.
Although we still get occasionally like Lemony Snicket
Yeah,
saying,
that
Klaus did not point out that.
right.
Yeah.
That's all that I have for chapter 3.
Okay. Yeah. I wasn't really like I didn't have this noted, but on that note, um, Handler seems to have a particular focus on describing recipes of food. I'm not sure if you've picked up on this or not.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm not quite sure why that is, but he describes, the puttanesca sauce
Uh-huh.
in the very first book, and I've got him a couple other times, I think, where he's talked about food and been very specific about either how to make it or what it's made of.
Absolutely. Yes. It's not it's a pretty common thing that you see, especially in fantasy literature,
Mm,
where there's a lot of descriptions about food in fantasy literature, and it's surprising. Like to me, I always find it surprising when it happens and why it happens. Right? I'm like, why
right.
are you doing that? Why are you getting into all of those details with it? And yeah, I don't know what to make of it because he definitely is interested in describing food. There's some
Yeah,
authors who become very interested in describing um, clothing and fashion and what people are wearing for the day. Do you know what I
right.
mean? Where you get like
Yeah,
pretty detailed descriptions of that. You have other authors who get really into descriptions of food or descriptions of like the weather. Like he'll just choose things to focus in on, and he absolutely does. I
yeah,
don't I don't know. Like
yeah.
I guess he likes to eat,
Right.
and therefore he's like, I'm going to put these in the books because if he's
Yeah,
really interested in food,
I
then
feel like it's specific foods that he probably really enjoys, and that he would like to talk to people about, but people have no idea what he's talking about when he mentions them,
it
like
seems
puttanesca
like it.
sauce. And it's
Yeah,
like, that's so random. And he's like, more people need to eat this, so I'm just going to
yeah.
put it in the book.
Maybe that's what it is. It's basically like a food blog.
Right. Yeah. Um, all right. All right, so my first real note is on page 54. We get this moment of sincerity just at the very top of 54 with Snicket writing, "The story of their lives was so miserable that I cannot say they felt happy when they were through telling it, but by the time Sunny concluded the whole long story, the Baudelaires felt as if they were carrying much less."
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it is just a nice moment of sincerity where it is uh, this idea of carrying a weight on your shoulders and all that. I think Handler really describes that well in this passage.
I
Um,
agree, and I think that it's a nice moment where he's giving us an insight into the human experience without being too direct about it, where
Yeah.
sometimes he'll say, here's a life lesson, and this is what
Right.
you need to know about life, but this is just kind of embedded in there, and it's not as overt as some of these other ones. It's not as intrusive. And
Yeah.
it is true that just talking about something, um,
Mm.
that doesn't change the situation, but sometimes that can be enough to make you feel a little bit better,
Yeah.
right? And it seems like a mystery, right? It's
Yeah.
psychologically, like, I'm not sure why that happens. I'm sure like there's theories out there, but it's just, I guess, in part you process by doing that. But if it doesn't change your situation, just by saying it to another person, why is it that that makes a difference? Like, but it
Yeah.
does,
Yep.
and we know that, and he just kind of leaves it there. Of, they seem surprised by this, right?
Yeah, yeah, there's no, explanation of, the expression weight on your shoulders and all that. Like, no, it's
Right, right.
doesn't do any of that. It is
No,
very much like, you know, you should pick up on this. Like kids should be able to pick up on this. Um, but yeah, it's
and
there. Yeah.
exactly, and that's where it's a moment of sincerity, that he's not
Yeah.
doing it in some way to, set up a joke where he's going to list off things or give a strange illustration for it,
Hmm.
or just be so overt about it that it ends up becoming silly.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Um, yeah. All right. So my next note is on page 61. So on page 61, then we have Hector uh, talks about the books that are in the library. And he says, there are not very many, Hector said, and nearly all of them are dull. There's one called The Littlest Elf that's probably the most boring book ever written. And this, yeah, it does give a nice little play and call back to what was talked about on page 2,
Yeah.
The Littlest Elf, which is really fun. And also, the 2004 movie version of this
Hmm.
actually starts out by showing this little animated thing of the littlest elf, and then it like the screen goes kind of dark and the elf just kind of freezes, and then you get Lemony Snicket starting to do a voiceover. So it's really interesting that they decided to, pick up on that in
Right,
order to introduce the movie. And so rereading this after seeing the movie, and I'm like, okay, this is actually really fun. Like,
right, right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
Um, yeah. And one other note is on page 64, just
Okay.
before the end of the chapter.
I just wanted to say, just with the littlest elf, that isn't it interesting though that like Snicket describes it as being
Oh, yes.
this book that is so superior to
Yeah.
a series of unfortunate events, and specifically to the Vile Village. And you should go and read The Littlest Elf, and then you have Hector who describes it, and it's just like, oh, it's terrible. It's the most boring book ever written. Uh,
Yeah.
so it's like, that's where, like, if kids like have not caught it, maybe they're reading this book, like, and they haven't read the other ones in the series, like that's where they can maybe start catching that you
Mm,
can't really trust what Snicket is saying, or at least
right.
Handler is saying through Snicket that there's
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
commentary on it.
Yeah, specifically with the mention of the Daily Punctilio, like the description of it and everything, then kids might not have caught on to that.
Right,
Um, that he's laying out his bias later on. But with this, then it's much more obvious. Yeah.
right.
All right, yes.
You
So
said
on page
64?
Yes, on page 64, Nevermore Tree was gargantuan, just at the top of the page. Nevermore Tree was gargantuan, a word which here means having attained an inordinate amount of botanical volume, a phrase which here means it was the biggest tree the Baudelaires had ever seen. So we're just getting a nice play on, his established structure here, um,
Yes.
where he is giving a definition that is not at all helpful, and then defining his definition.
Right. I feel like I end up doing that in the classroom all the time because I'll say a word and then I'll say, "Does anybody know what that means?" And usually the answer is no, because I usually only ask it if I know that it's a fairly tough word, like an unconventional word that they probably have not encountered yet. And then typically no one can answer it, so then I'll say, "Okay, what it means is this," and then I'll give the formal definition, and I'll say, "What this actually means is this." And because
Right.
I'm like, I want them to know the formal definition, but the formal
Yes.
definition on its own is not helpful until you
Yes.
then give the other one. But in this case, like he's not even like, yeah, he's still playing. Yeah, I mean, I guess he is giving a genuine definition because he's saying a word like the usage of gargantuan in this particular instance means having attained an inordinate amount of botanical volume. Um,
Right.
that he is doing like that is a technical description of how he's using it, and then yeah, he gives the proper one. But yeah, but when I do it, like I don't do it to be funny, but he's
Right.
definitely doing it to be funny here.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so those are my only notes for chapter 3.
Okay, and yeah, I don't have any others. So all
Okay.
right, chapter 4. I've only got 2 notes for it. Um, so on page 71, then they're talking about the couplet, right?
Yes.
And so this is Hector. So from the bottom of 70, this is Hector who grabs it. He leans down and handed the scrap of paper to Violet and gave Sunny a little pat on the head before walking out of the parlor and leaving the children alone. Without speaking, Violet unrolled the paper so the siblings could read the couplet again. For sapphires, we're held in here. Only you can end our fear. It's her, Klaus said, speaking quietly so Hector wouldn't hear him. I'm sure of it. Isadora Quagmire wrote this poem. I think so too, Violet said. I'm positive it's her handwriting. Blake, Sunny said, which meant, and the poem is written in Isadora's distinct literary style. So, I mean, I know that this is a reference to William Blake,
Hmm.
um, and I don't know if you are familiar with Blake.
I'm not particularly, but I did catch that that was a reference to him. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why has Sonny say Blake in this case, why Handler chooses William Blake to be the poet, um, is that Blake was a romantic poet. So from like he did most of his publishing in the early 1800s, early 19th century, and he was playing with form when it comes to poetry. I legitimately am teaching a William Blake poem tomorrow in class. So this is helpful. Like I'm on topic here. And so
Gotcha.
what Blake did was he was also a visual artist as well. And so if you look at the poem The Tiger by William Blake, even if you just do this while I'm talking right now, or anybody who's watching the podcast, and if you end up remembering, you can throw it into the actual like podcast. You could put up an image of it, but specifically look Google Images William Blake The Tiger, and Tiger's with a Y. It's not with an I. Um, and he used a Y instead of an I because he thought that a Y makes the word look springier, like a tiger. Because doesn't a Y look like it's like boom, like it could bounce if you push down a Y, that it would turn into a spring? And
Yeah.
so the way Blake played with form is because he was a visual artist and also a poet, then he would embed the poetry with his illustrations. And so you look at that, and like if I looked at a poem and I did not have a name next to it, and somebody said, like if it was a Jeopardy category and they showed different poems, they'd be like, who's this poet, right? And it's like, oh, it could be Keats, it could be Shelley, it could be Wordsworth, it could be whoever, right? Like romantic poet. And then you look at it, you go, well, that's Blake, because Blake played with form, and we know that.
Right.
And
Gotcha.
so it's that to me is what's going on here. And I'm pretty sure that Handler is doing this intentionally, that you cannot mistake a Blake poem that looks like that for any other poet. That
Hmm.
you would look at that and you'd say,
Gotcha.
well, that's got to be a Blake poem. I know it because Blake does this. If he wrote a poem called The Tiger, he would draw a tiger where his tail then goes up, like next to the poem itself, and kind of weaving all of these different things together because he
Right.
wants to play with both the visual element and the textual, the poetry, the words themselves. He wants to play with the form of those things together. So you could have a little snippet of it and then say, that's unmistakable. So then saying, I know that it's her, I'm sure of it, Isadora Quagmire wrote this poem, then I'm looking at this, and then Sonny says, Blake, Sonny said, which meant, and the poem is written in Isadora's distinct literary style. And I'm like, yes, because some poets do have a distinct literary style. And it's an appreciation for poetry and for writers and for paying close attention to the unique voice that some poets have or some writers have, that some stuff is unmistakable.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And going off of that, of course, Lemony Snicket has a very unique style in these books. A very recognizable one where you would instantly recognize anything that is written by him because of his, particular stylistic choices.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you just had a random page and somebody handed it to you, and if you've read these books and they said it's a middle grade book, it's a page from it, and even if it didn't have character names on there, right? Or even if it was something that he wrote entirely differently, but in the same voice, in the same style, you would catch it. You go, well, that's very much a Snicket way of writing.
Yes. Absolutely.
And it's, in a sense, instructional, it's didactic. It's another instance of teaching children how to appreciate literature in order to understand what literature does. But this is like really, they're not going to catch the reference to Blake. Like, I just don't see that happening. Like a 10-year-old going, William Blake, of course, I know who you're talking about. But by saying, we recognize that this is Isadora's poem, because we know her voice in poetry, then it's teaching children you can recognize writers by the way they write.
Right. Yeah.
And you should have an appreciation. That's what I'm saying. It's an appreciation of literature.
Yeah. No, that's great. I'm so glad that you were able to give more insight into that. Yeah. All right. Do you have anything else for this chapter?
The only other thing that I have, and you had mentioned it before, it's on page 74, where we've just got Snicket with his anti-media bias.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, that was all.
Okay. All right. So on page 79, in the middle of the page, when Hector tells them that they can't just go climbing up the Nevermore tree, Violet says, "We've climbed up a tower and down an elevator shaft. Climbing a tree should be no problem." And I just went, yeah, I wanted to forget about those things.
Yeah.
But yes, you're right. Clearly, you are very skilled climbers.
Yeah. Yeah, world class.
Yeah. All right, next on page 81. Let me see. Where was... oh, yes. Very top of page 81. I believe, Klaus says, "We can't wait another second. The last time we found them, we left them alone for a few minutes, and they were gone again." No, you left them for like 7 hours.
This is a great point. This is a great point. It was at least 7 hours. It really was. It really was. Because they spent at least an hour back in that apartment researching.
Yeah.
Yep. Several minutes. Oh, and it's like they didn't know what VFD meant, and it's like, yeah, they had 7 hours, 7+ hours to go and do whatever else, but they didn't have 7 seconds to wait there and hear what VFD stands for. And
yes,
yeah, it's you are right, like what you said about before with like, oh, they climbed a tower and climbed down an elevator shaft, and I'm like, yeah, don't remind us of all of these things. Don't remind us of all of these stupid moments.
Honestly. Yeah, we left them alone for a few minutes. Not even several minutes or anything, like a few. 3 or more. I don't know how many it was. A few hours would be more appropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. My last note is just on page 83 when Sunny says contraire, and she is speaking French there momentarily. Yeah, that's my only note there, but it's we get several instances within these first four chapters of Sunny saying things that actually do have meaning. Um, and they seem to be becoming more common as we go through this
Yeah.
series rather than it just being baby talk. And I
Yes.
appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we
It
really are
does,
seeing that.
yeah, it does honestly make me want to go through every single thing that she says and figure out if there is some kind of, maybe it's an anagram of something,
Right.
or uh, yeah, or just some language that I don't recognize.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, I want to get feedback from people who are following along with this series that we're doing, because we've pointed out instances where Snicket seems to have the opportunity to make a reference and then doesn't really follow through, and he'll bring up something you're like, okay, like like with Dr. Orwell, for instance, in The
Yeah,
Miserable Mill, we're like,
yeah,
okay, why Orwell? Like, what is it about George Orwell that is relating to this? Like, what's the significance other than just famous writer?
right.
That's a reference. So on the one hand, then I'm curious about that, if there is more to what Sonny is saying here. But
Mhm.
part of me suspects that he's just, that's a funny word. That'd be a funny sound. I'll just put that in.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but we absolutely are getting more instances and more frequency of her saying things that do make sense.
Yeah, yeah, and it is a good sign that the children are growing up. Um,
Yes.
that Sunny is developing her language skills more, and even when he describes Klaus at the very beginning of this book, then he says who was almost 13,
Yeah.
rather than just saying that he's 12.
Right.
So yeah, it's
Yeah. And as you pointed out before, that it seems like since all of the adults in this community are so stupid and the children are smart, that as they get older, they seem to do more and more things that are kind of stupid. And it's like, I think you were smarter before, but Sonny's getting
right.
smarter because, right? And so it's funny because like it works. As Sonny gets smarter, they're tailing off now. Violet and
Yes.
House.
Absolutely. Yeah, but anyway, so those are my only notes for chapters 1 to 4. I know that this went on for a little while, but
Yeah.
a few minutes.
Yeah. A few minutes, a few seconds. Um, yeah, so we'll move on to the middle chapters, chapters 5 to 8. But it is interesting that, because we've kind of been commenting on this, at what point in the book do we see Olaf,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
And so far, no sign of him, and we're 86 pages in.
right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that the books are less focused on Olaf now and are more focused on the Quagmires, um,
Yes.
their
Yeah.
situation. Because we saw that in Bierset's elevator as well,
Yeah. Good point.
um, where the children aren't as concerned about where Olaf is, but they are very concerned about where the Quagmires are.
That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the way to view it. That makes
Yeah.
sense. All right. Well, we'll leave it off with that for today. And
Yeah.
so, if you are following along, make sure that you do read chapters 5 to 8 for next week, and we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.
Ignore the tattoo! A phrase here which means like, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast across the web. That may seem like a strange definition, but in this context, it is entirely accurate.